Welcome to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. I thought, in light of the last lesson, I needed to do a brief recap because the concepts are so significant, and yet I was developing it, and the way that I developed it was a little slow in setting it forth. So let me summarize it, and I think you'll have the essence of what I was trying to communicate. The issue that I was addressing is the fact that it seems that most Protestant scholarship is unaware of the classical education that we need in order to practice authentically a historical grammatical exegesis. And the issue is not grammatical, it is historical. We don't have the eyes to see the New Testament through that the first century recipients would have, who were skilled in theories of poetics that came from Aristotle. The way that developed is that Aristotle examined all of the human production that had to do with poetry and literature and plays and dramas and everything that's imitative, mimetic in its art form. And he found that they fell into four basic categories. And he named those epic and tragic, and then lyric and comedic. So he developed that inductively just by looking at what humans produce. Now those categories are very significant because the Greeks explored all of them and gave us many of our conventions for identifying them as genres. Well, what is a genre? A genre really is something that helps us to interpret a text. It gives us a context for that text. I think the evidence of the fact that we don't understand genres is that the Revelation has been interpreted as having an apocalyptic genre. Well, there is no such thing. And yet most modern scholarship has been taken away with the idea that it was written in a particular fashion, and all of that in the most latest scholarship has pretty well collapsed. People realize that no consensus of opinion has arisen about it. There is the thought that in times of persecution, people write in a unique style that I think is authentic. There is a work by Leo Strauss called Persecution and the Art of Writing. But he's talking about a way of speaking of certain enemies, perhaps in metaphors, so that we're not attacking them directly and inviting their response. But I don't think, he would certainly understand that we're not talking about a genre form. Epic is the overarching theme. The grand narrative of the Bible is epic. But the epic was defined early in the 8th or 9th century among the Greeks by Homer, and it's never been surpassed and probably won't be. The poetry there is magnificent. But epic is constituted of two documents. A Virgil will write one document, but it will have two parts to it, and they follow the same thing. With Homer, you have the Iliad, which is the tragic story of the fall of the city of Troy, and then you have conjoined to it is the Odyssey, which is the return of Odysseus to his home country and back to Ithaca. So you have two potential tales of the heroes. Achilles is the hero of the Iliad, and Odysseus Ulysses is the hero of the Odyssey. Both of them fail, which is significant. We need to talk about that in its own context. But the two ideas together, the tragic followed by the comic, which is Ulysses, the many-turning, twisted Ulysses, who is a trickster. All of these ideas are very helpful, as we will see. So epic is really the conjunction of both primary genres, that is tragedy and comedy. The book of Acts, Luke's great treatise, which itself is a diptych with the gospel. And there are two treatises that everybody recognizes were by the same hand. He is imitating the art form because the the tale of those two books primarily is how the city of Jerusalem is like a new Troy. It's going to be destroyed, as Christ foretold. And then there is a long sea journey of Paul, who is on his way to Rome to give testimony before Caesar. And so the city of Jerusalem is under judgment and will be destroyed, and the gospel will then be headquartered, probably is the implication, in a new Rome, in a Christian Rome, is the idea. So he's retelling the Aeneid, which was the founding document of the Romans, by the way that he has conjoined the two treatises to Theophilus in Luke, the Gospel, and in Acts. Well, the same idea is in the Bible when you have the tragic vision followed by the comedic vision. And we'll see that's profoundly significant. The tragedy, that its trajectory is from up to down, from high to low, will be followed by comedy, which will rise from low to high. There are certain thoughts and certain devices that you look for. The idea of the trickster is comedic, for example. And we'll see that in some of the discussion we'll have today. In Revelation, there is a trickster that comes that everything depends on. It's the story of the underdog. It's the unexpected, the Hail Mary pass. When Bradbury used it in the first Star Wars with the Death Star that's overwhelmingly evil. And there's only one shot that can rescue the rebels, that sort of thing. It's showing that evil is profoundly wicked and overwhelming in its force, and yet it's very fragile, which is ironic. The same is true in Tolkien with Mordor, which is overwhelmingly evil, and nothing can resist its power but a little hobbit hero character, an Iron. Ironically, nobody would put any store by a hobbit. He has a ring he can throw into the lava of Mordor, and then evil collapses, like the Death Star is destroyed. That idea, typically done by a trick that wasn't foreseen, shows the power of the comedic vision, and evil is destroyed and a new order begins, typically followed by marriages, like you see in The Lord of the Rings. At the end of the trilogy there, the triptych, you have everybody gets married, and so this is very typical of this kind of thing. So you've got the epic is comedy, or tragedy and comedy in that order together. Those are the two grand visions, the smiling mask and the frowning mask of the Greek theater, because almost everything is comedy and tragedy. Aristophanes is the one who explored all of the genre dimensions of comedy, mapped out the terrain of comedy. We have three great tragedians that remain from the Greek world. You've got Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, and they wrote magnificent tragedies which transcend time and culture. So they were reaching for something that's deep into the soul of man. Lyric is a harder one to describe, and there are fewer examples. The most famous examples would be Pindar, who sang of the Olympian victors, and Sappho of Lesbos and her poetry. That would be lyric. What Aristotle identified these simply by examining them and seeing that they had contours, they had similar devices and themes and story, which means basically there are only four stories. There are four grand stories that together constitute the grand narrative. It's like we have three primary colors, and from those three colors we have this beautiful palette that can be derived by their mixture and admixture. So anyway, what Aristotle observed, it's been interesting that as the Psalter, the Hebrew Bible, as the Psalms have been studied over the last couple of centuries, studied in depth, especially since Gunkel, I think, really, the nature of Hebrew prosody and poetry and all of that has been identified. And what we've seen in examining Hebrew poetry is that there are four typical stories. And so we give them different names, but they constitute the same poetic vision of the mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination of humanity. You have in the Psalter, you have praise psalms that just simply talk about God and his work, whether it's in creation or in salvation. They simply consider his attributes, and he is the grand storyteller. And so I think those would correspond very neatly with the epic of the Greek understanding. You've got lament psalms. Again, almost half of the psalms are lament psalms, where the psalmist is in some kind of distress and can't think of his way out. And he prays in confidence to God that God will deliver him. But it's still a tragic vision, because if God doesn't deliver him, then he will be destroyed. And it's filled with tears and crying. And that corresponds very neatly to the lament psalms. The Hebrew lament psalms correspond to the tragic vision and observe a number of the same conventions, actually. Then you've got the comic vision that comes out of that, which is a beautiful example of that would be Psalm 126. And let me show you how that works. It's one of the songs of ascent. The direction of comedy is always up. And you go in Israel, you go up to Jerusalem, up to Zion. So the psalmist writes, when the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, so they were in a lamentable state. Their city and temple had been destroyed. They'd been carried into captivity into the east. But God had caused them to be able to be free and to return to the land. So the psalmist sings of that. When the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, we were like those who dream. The vision of comedy is you dream in tragedy, but that dream becomes like a reality. Then our mouths were filled with laughter and our tongue with singing. So they're no longer weeping like they do in Psalm 137, the lament for the destruction of Jerusalem. Our mouth was filled with laughter, our tongue with singing. And they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The nations admired the saving work of God, which wouldn't have happened had he not ordained the destruction of his own temple. And we can see in that a foreshadowing of the destruction of the temple of his son that would bring about the praise of the nations. And so we are glad. So we've entered into, after the resurrection, we enter into the comedy of the walk of faith. Then the psalmist says, bring back our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. And he who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. So you go forth in tears, but you come back in joy. It's very clear, very correspondent. It's a psalm of thanksgiving. So the thanksgiving psalms, which celebrate and give public acknowledgement to God for delivering the psalmist from some lamentable state, they correspond precisely and beautifully with the comic vision of the Greeks. The lyric, I mentioned that's Psalm 45. The only example I can think of that clearly is from the Psalter, but that's also the book of the Song of Songs, which celebrates the wedding of the son of David. Psalm 45, the bride of the king of Jerusalem, the son of David, is, which ultimately speaks of the church, of course, is told to forget her past, implying that there was a lamentable condition in that past, and to rejoice in the fact that she's been arrayed in beauty and made ready for her groom. And that will, of course, translate into chapter 21, when the bride comes down from heaven, interestingly, not from earth. We'll have to talk about that. But she comes down having made herself ready for the Son of God himself, the bridegroom. So these ideas, the Greeks identified and called the epic, the tragic, the lyric, and the comic. And then the Hebrew poetry that identifies these same kinds of psalms, the thanksgiving psalms, that follow the lament psalms, the epic psalms of praise, and then the wedding psalm of Psalm 45, along with the Song of Songs. They fit perfectly. It's like a Cinderella slipper. They fit perfectly, the categories of the Greek and the Hebrew. And so God can speak both through Hebrew and his inspired texts and through Greek. And we'll see that that's significant too to our study of Revelation. But they're helpful to have these categories so you know what kind of literature you're dealing with. That means Revelation fits into one of these categories. The tragic voice of the gospel that ends largely with the passion of our Lord, although there's the comic turn of the resurrection. But largely it's the opposition to Christ and his ultimate demise in his mortal death and burial. All of that is followed by the quick notice of the resurrection and then the restorations that begin. But the true restoration is in Revelation. So these two books of John also constitute the whole epic vision that goes from the beginning of time. The gospel opens up with, in the beginning, looking back to the creation that Moses described of the first heavens and earth, and it ends with, behold, I make a new heavens and a new earth, looking into eternity future. It's a canvas between the two books of John that's large enough to describe all of time. The vision of Revelation is all of heaven. The vision of the gospel is the ministry, the Christ ministry on earth. So he has a canvas that is large enough to describe all of space and time, and in that he shows that Christ is the preeminent figure of all of it, and he does it magnificently, but again within certain conventional limits that would have been very understandable to the first century. And they're marvelous and helpful, I think, to understand that. So what happens is, when I realized in thinking about Hebrew poetry, and there's been a lot of development of that and the theory of it during my lifetime, but I think some of its conventions have been better identified as we've gone along, certainly since Gunkel was writing. But the correspondence of these categories is really remarkable to me, and that means that the categories, the four gestures of the soul, which is how the Greeks understood it, the human imagination can understand four stories. And everything that we know in imitative art, mimetic art, is a retelling of that. All of opera is about love and death, so that's going to be the tragic and the comic vision. And all of our novels and plays, there's something in that we can identify broad. If it's well written, we can identify broad gestures and an awareness of these conventions of how to write and what's appropriate to a particular story. If we're aware of that, it is very helpful in understanding the book. And to understand Revelation as comedy, as the first century audience would have, is an insight that really is helpful, unlike this alleged genre of apocalyptic literature, for which there is nothing comparable. And it is not a genre. If we understand the appropriate genre, that's going to be very helpful. Comedy ends almost always in a wedding. Revelation ends in that wedding between Christ and the people of God, the elect chosen of God. The Father has chosen those that are elect, and that he's chosen the bride, and he's set a wedding time for them, and that opens up the vision then of the new heavens and the new earth. It's a new beginning, and comedies typically end in a happily ever after moment. And Revelation certainly does that. So the first century people who looked at this, if we're going to read Revelation, not just grammatically, but also historically, then we have to understand its comedic character. There's deep irony in that, as we will see, and that gives it a richness. Irony is also very typically comedy. So we'll have to understand how that works. But with these insights, it will help us, I think, trying to look at the story of Revelation through the eyes of the first century people, the Hellenistic people that would have gone to the theater and had these categories very fixed and firmly in mind. I think that will help us enormously as we go forward. But I wanted to recap that. I developed it, but I think it's helpful to draw it explicitly and make it and slim it down a bit so that it can be comprehended. That will help us enormously as we go forward. Thank you for listening. Please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel if this has been useful to you or intriguing. To learn more, you can visit my webpage, drwarrengage.com, or find me on my Patreon account, patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. I hope you'll join me next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. Thank you.